I have to admit that collecting vintage Tamiyas has become something of an addiction. And this is the latest in my vintage Tamiya endeavors. This is the Tamiya Astute. And if you have been trolling around eBay recently, this body may look familiar. I picked this up off of eBay from someone in France, and I got a pretty good deal on it. So I'm just going to go over the chassis and just to give you an idea of what's going on here. So the Astute, as you may already know, was Tamiya's first real attempt at a competitive two-wheel drive buggy. And at first glance, it looks much like a modern two-wheel drive buggy. You know, it has front suspension arms, shock tower, camber links, front and rear, you know, gearbox, everything you would expect to have in a car. But if you look closer, there are some very interesting features that this car has that suggest to some that it was over-engineered. Okay, so we'll start at the front. You'll notice there's a sway bar at the front, and I think also at the rear. Yeah, right here, there is a sway bar. So a sway bar is front and rear. Is that the sway bar? No, that is not the sway bar, sorry. That is something else. That is the rear toe link. But I'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, sway bar in the front. Okay. If you look at all of the hinges, where any of the hinge pins mount, so the inner arm, the outer arm, the upper hub here, also on the rear arms, wherever you have hinge pins, there are bushings. So there's a bushing here, a bushing here, a bushing here and here. Also on the steering knuckle here, a bushing at the top and bottom because there's a hinge pin that goes through that. There are bushings here. There are bushings all around, which ideally you would replace with bearings. And the idea there is to make the suspension as smooth as possible and eliminate any slop that would otherwise exist in the suspension. So right now there are metal bushings in here. In time I'm going to replace them all with bearings to make it even smoother. So the criticism there is, okay, you have all these metal pieces, you're adding weight to the chassis, and that can slow the car down. But I think it's just from an engineering standpoint, it's a very interesting approach toward designing a suspension, is to put bushings wherever you have, or bearings, ideally, wherever you have moving parts. The shocks that came with it are just the standard cheapo yellow plastic shocks. The shock piston in here, I believe, is just the shock shaft and the piston are connected, and there's no holes in the piston. The piston just has a smaller diameter than the shock body, and the oil flows around the outer circumference of the shock piston, and that's how you get your damping. Okay, so in time I will replace these with some higher end shocks. Let's see, fiberglass front shock tower. This happens to have a carbon fiber rear shock tower here. Might be an aftermarket unit, possibly from Fiberlight, I don't know. But Fiberlight does make carbon fiber units for the front and rear shock towers and the chassis for the Super Astute, not the original Astute. But those should be compatible with this chassis. One of the main differences between the Astute and the Super Astute was with the Astute, the battery was mounted laterally like this. With the Super Astute, it was mounted inline. Okay, and you can do that conversion on this chassis if you want. You just have to drill a few holes for that. What is particularly interesting about this chassis is really more towards the rear. Okay, so let's get in here. So let's see. We'll start with the gearbox. Kind of hard to see all these with these black pieces here. So the gearbox has no slipper clutch and a ball differential. And the ball differential, if you look in the manual for the Astute, is almost exactly the same unit as the Tamiya Egress. So if you go back and you look at the rebuild video or the restoration video that I did for my Tamiya Egress, I had one of those parts where I went through the ball differential, and basically it has two thrust bearings, one on either side, and it's actually really interesting design. The only difference is the number of teeth on the differential. So the Astute differential has one more tooth than the egress differential, but they're otherwise the exact same part. In the Super Astute, the gearbox came with a slipper clutch, but they switched out the ball diff for a gear diff. So that didn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, I can understand having a slipper clutch so that you make it slip a little bit if you have low traction, but the other function of a slipper clutch is to protect the drivetrain, in particular the ball differential, if you have a ball diff. So ideally what you would have is a slipper clutch with a ball diff. The third generation chassis that Tamiya came out with, the Dynastorm, had exactly that. It had a ball diff and a slipper clutch. But if you set the ball diff reasonably tight and you don't run too hot of a motor in here, it should be fine. You don't really need a slipper. The rear hub carriers are perhaps the most interesting feature here, in my own opinion. They were designed in a way to allow you to adjust rear toe-in. So on a modern chassis, if you want to adjust toe-in, it's done by some combination of the hub carrier and the toe block that mounts under the rear bulkhead. So that's, at least on an associated RC10 B4 series chassis, that's how you would do it. So you could get, like, say, a 3 degree toe block and for under the bulkhead, and then say a 0 degree or a ½ degree or a 1 degree hub on the hub carrier. The way this works is you have this link here that connects to this little arm that sticks out from the rear hub carrier, and you can move this in or out, and you can adjust rear toe. And then this guy here is your rear camber link. So this does make it potentially difficult to have perfect wheel alignment, because you need to know exactly how long this link needs to be to get 1 degree or 1.5 or 2 degrees or however much rear toe-in you want. So it's best to have a setup station to adjust this. What some people have done to get around this is just to use a simpler rear hub carrier, like from the Tamiya Madcap. That's a fixed toe block or a fixed toe-in hub carrier, just like most hub carriers are, so that they can eliminate this camber link here. Because the problem also is that this little arm was prone to breaking. So if it snapped, then this thing's going to flop around, and you're not going to have fixed toe-in. But that was really very much ahead of its time, I think, because even today it's not very common to find chassis with this kind of adjustability for toe-in. Most chassis have very discrete toe-in adjustments in ½ degree increments. This, you can make it whatever you want. So I thought that's kind of neat. So this is basically it. In time, I'm going to go through and clean this all up, and maybe make a few upgrades. For example, these tie rods here, I'll replace them with titanium turnbuckles, go through, put in a stainless steel hex screw set, all the nice stuff. But I am quite busy as of late, so this is going to have to wait a while. But I at least wanted to do a very basic overview of this chassis and just show you how it looks, in case you've never seen an Astute up close and personal before. It's a pretty interesting chassis. So, yeah, that's it for now. Thanks for watching.